was 20 years old when I was an architecture student feeling extraordinarily frustrated with the lack of vision in a course that was all about how do we design the environments that we live in. And my housemate showed me David's book on permaculture, and it's not too much to say that it completely reorganised my life. I went, here is a system of thinking, and it's a local person, and it's comprehensive, it's addressing design as I know it, but it has a very strong value system that I felt like I could completely get behind. So it was, since then I was doing permaculture as an architecture student, and it was, it made everything feel like it was in alignment, and it felt like I was completely out of alignment with the system that I was in, so I ended up having to drop out.
Sorry.
You've done that to a lot of people, David, we know that. But in the end, it was all to the good, because sooner rather than later there were organisations out there saying we need designers who understand that we've got a big scale problem that needs really comprehensive thinking, systems thinking to solve. And so I ended up getting a fantastic job at an urban design company, talking to the developers about how to introduce permaculture into large-scale urban systems. So, follow your dreams, follow the impulse that permaculture lends was really the lesson. When I was 22, I went off and I was an intern at the International Permaculture Conference. That was the 1993 conference in Copenhagen. And Bill Mollison was there. People from all over the world, including ministers in governments, ministers of permaculture in African governments. There were people from Pacific Islands, Central America, Asia. It was an incredible gathering, really exciting time. That was quite a while ago. And since then, I've been watching the movement, I worked at Ceres Community Environment Park, and 20 years ago, along with David's help, started the Autumn Equinox Harvest Festival, which was to be a showcase for permaculture and for what Ceres was doing. David was and Sue were the honoured guests, and did a whole lot of demonstration of permaculture principles. The idea there was about a closed loop system. We harvest together, we cook together, we eat together, and then we compost together and make that into a ritual. Because there was something that in Bill's book that I wrote down as a bit of a mantra. It's the challenge, I can feel like I can almost say it, I'll probably say it wrong. It's the challenge for the educators and the artists to revive the songs and the dances and the stories that give us and our lives meaning. And I just went, this is what we need. We need cultural forums where we can feel what it's like to live within the values that so many of us hold very dear, yet the mainstream system doesn't support. And then we got a grant to assess the effectiveness of that festival, the Autumn Equinox Harvest Festival, and as part of it I came and did in-depth interviews with you. Yep. And part of that process was, we talked then about how we don't live in a system that supports the things that we're doing. So what we're doing, in a way, we're playing, we're practicing, we are keeping the skills alive for when they're really needed. So we are, we're keeping our chops up so that we can be ready to really seed solutions when things change. It's an interesting time right now. I think so many of us feel that I know that I'm not alone in expecting a very different outcome from the climate election than to get a Liberal government and Greens vote not really moving. It's that sense of what do we do at this point? There are so many people doing great things, particularly here in the Yarra Valley where I live. I'm in Warburton. I know there's lots of great things happening. I'm not very well connected. David and Sue are on tour promoting their amazing book, RetroSuburbia, said, can we come and stay with you on our way through? And I said, look, could we have a chat with the local community present? They said yes, so this is how we're here. So thank you so much for your yes. So I rang...
Our plus that we are here.
Yeah, thank you. Neither of them have been to Warburton. I know, we're shocked. So I rang Trav and said, look, can we do something that is not just a talk, but is also a networking opportunity? When you came in, you put down your name and your area of work. We're really interested in seeing what we can grow from tonight. There's Permaculture Yarra Valley already does great work, but how can we build the movement? How can we grow stronger links between each other, support each other, enhance the works that we're all also doing, but also how, and this is one of the questions that we're really keen to talk to David about tonight, how do we make those links into the rest of the community? You know, like there is a critical mass of us here in the valley to feel like there's always good things happening, but there are so many people who we live amongst who have no contact with any of that kind of story. So this is sort of the questions here that we're interested in teasing out. How can we build our network and support our network, and how can we grow links into the mainstream kind of situation that we've got here. So that's sort of some of the seed questions, and we're going to have a bit of a conversation. There'll be questions and there'll be more networking at the end. So I'll just start really with that.
Well, I suppose I should say, after being at the celebrity speaker at the climate farming forum last night, where I was appropriately dressed. I'm now in my farm clothes after thought I'd better get dressed in those because I was out at Graham's. We did actually go out and pick a few veggies and sort of wander around the property, but and you said that was entirely appropriate clothing to arrive at this event, and I can see that she got yeah.
My original leggings, deer and mountains.
Yeah, so and it is interesting that swap of last night having the privilege of being the most well-known of the speakers, and yet being, if you like, if not the fringe person, the person invited to give some challenging perspectives, and being able to slot into that space, through to being, oh, this is my tribe.
Yeah.
Which is an experience I first had when I went to the first International Permaculture Convergence, which was in 1984 at a field study centre at a little place called Papenbarra on the mid-north coast of New South Wales. And I really went to sort of see, what is this thing that Mollison's created, this movement? Yes, I was always the co-originator of the permaculture concept, but a little bit of a sceptic about this huge, fast upwelling into first both popular culture that happened in the late 70s, that is sometimes a bit hard to explain to younger people, how did that happen? And then by the 80s, that permaculture activism in a way going underground, going back into the counterculture, its countercultural roots, as the greed is good culture sort of captured the 80s.
Yes.
And all of that hippie nonsense, as well as the Club of Rome limits to growth, all of that was garbage. So going to that convergence was, oh yes, there are other people that think like me, and I belong here.
Yes.
So for me, that's been a very slow journey to that position of acknowledging, especially as the surviving of the two co-originators of the permaculture concept, some sort of leadership role in what is now a global movement, and incredibly broadly spread in the world and diverse in its applications. But Australia is the place where it has sort of inoculated the mainstream the most, with sort of mycelial roots that go out into obviously related fields like the city farms and community gardens movement and networks in Australia, land care, but many other things. So I think there's both the permaculture as a movement of like-minded people who get some support in their subcultural difference from mainstream society. In the way that my mother said, look, the purpose of a demo is not to convince the public or the politicians, it's for the activists to get together and feel strong together and have some social reinforcement at other times are out doing the hard yards, talking to the people on the street, talking to the people in the schools, talking to the people across the back fence.
Yes.
And so similarly, gatherings, whether it's at the scale of permaculture convergences or more impromptu, spontaneous events like this one, do help that, yes, we do have some nurturing reinforcement amongst people with similar values, because the corrosion of the mainstream culture is, for most people, very difficult. For some of us, it's a gravitational pull back, being sucked back into a world that some of us have needed to free ourselves from. And in others, it's this enticing sort of, just come over here. And so those values are important. And my Jewish ancestors didn't just live in the ghetto because they were forced into the ghetto. They maintained culture through the centuries by that process.
Yes.
So it is completely valid to not have yourself overwhelmed by whether it's the news or whether it's what's going on in work situations or in politics or in this sense of the mass mainstream culture. It's not living in a dream world or unable to deal with reality to say, no, we need that social reinforcement and that challenge to go further. And maybe I could flip to Sue about her experience talking to Meg Allman some years ago about shopping.
Oh, that was actually Meg and Patrick. And Patrick, I wasn't actually talking.
Sorry, I just want to check. Can everyone hear out the back? How's it? How was it?
Yep, you can hear?
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, I thought might do that. So, hadn't met Patrick and Meg very much before this conversation they were having with someone else. And Patrick sort of said, well, you know, we haven't been to the supermarket for 18 months now. And he went on to say something else, but I was stopped a bit. 18 months, he hasn't been to the supermarket. And I'm still going to the supermarket, even if it's only to buy toilet paper and soap. I can't have this. He doesn't go to the supermarket. And they never went again. It's like you just need the impetus sometimes of one little thing. And, I thought, I do lots of things and blah, blah, blah. But then I hadn't been to the supermarket for 18 months. And it changed immediately what I did. And so toilet paper, so what do you do about toilet paper? Oh, well, second-hand phone books, leaves, all sorts of nice things out in the garden. The boys are
We've got lots of tobacco bush around here. It's very soft.
Lambsy is good, dock is not bad, but you get particular plants in particular seasons, so that's another way of looking at it. Oh, this is my toilet paper for this month or whatever. The boys.
Can't you get toilet paper at Tonner's?
I wasn't going to go to Tonner's.
Oh.
You couldn't
That's the local.
No, actually, you
alternative.
couldn't buy toilet paper at Tonner's or soap.
Oh, right. You can
All right,
see
we've
I
done
don't
that
do the
already.
shopping.
I would have done that already, but. So then the soap thing was a bit more difficult because I hadn't started to make soap because, in effect, I didn't like the fact that people were using goat's milk and olive oil and all these food things to just wash off a bit of dirt off your body. It didn't seem right, so I never made the soap. But anyway, I got conned into doing a workshop with one of our friends, and we make soap once a year with, the washing up soap is a hard soap that we use, so it's got all the nasties, the caustic soda that you have to buy and all these things. But it's waste, the oils, etc. I use the waste oils. But washing powder, one of our woofers came along and she said, and I was saying about, an alternative to the laundry liquid or powder. And she said, oh, look at my white shirt. I wash with the stuff that I make, and it's a French recipe, and all it has in it is ash and water to make you lye, which is the really strong alkaline, and then also the used oils. And we've got real great access to used oils, and that was it. I went, eureka, we're there. So those two things, what I'm saying after all that is...
As well as
that
recipes.
practical lesson in soap making.
is that, in community you have these things that spread you out gently, but also you have things that happen because you're doing things with your friends that then do have an influence on others, but in the meantime, you're not having to do the strong activism and to give up the great life that we all want to have.
So I think, that's a long circuit from...
Good.
I can't even remember what was the...
Oh, come on.
This is how these conversations always go. It's excellent. Well, it was the sense of where were we starting? That sense of
spread to mainstream.
we're wanting to support and encourage our own alternative economies, alternative cultures. So grow them in exactly as you said. To have each other means that we can build that stronger, and we can have that reinforcement, we can have that reflection, and we can have that joyful sharing of, look, this is our life, this is our culture, this is my partner who's a gardener who also sings songs about the seasons. It's that sense of you do the work and you celebrate the work, like James so beautifully demonstrated. So many of us are doing that. We're doing the work and we're celebrating the work, and we need each other for that. So as you said, you answered it beautifully. But there's also
that one side of.
There's also the sense of, well, we need a certain sort of perhaps a critical mass and critical enthusiasm and aliveness of this culture, so that it appeals to more people. I think.
So I think one of the optimistic things about that is that if we move away from the both majority politics and the mass market, whether it's mass media or the supermarket, this notion of how do you get the most customers, the most votes, the big, everyone's grasping for that middle mass market. to recognise that actually a lot of social change doesn't work that way. By the time it's actually a mass of people doing it, the event's already happened in terms of some innovation in society or whatever. That a lot of the research shows that within some constituent community of connected people, when there's some new activity or behaviour which is being adopted, which is outside of norms, when it gets to about 30% of people adopting that new behaviour, then the other 70% start to think that they are the minority. And I actually experienced this first time. I went to a men's festival in 1982 and didn't regard myself as homophobic, but I suddenly thought, shit, are a majority of guys gay here? There weren't, but that was the first time I'd been in a place where that culture was out there and open, and suddenly I thought, oh, maybe I'm a minority. And I wasn't. Now, Shani Graham in Hulbert Street, in the change that they did, street level sustainability inspired by my Aussie Street story, she said when it was about 20% of the people in the street were engaged, the 80% started to think, oh, is this the new normal?
And when they thought it was the new normal, did they go, we're afraid of it and we don't want it, or we want to be part of that?
It was a mixture. Some go, oh, this is the thing. This is
the
what
thing to
people do. Yeah, like this is the new normal. And others were sort of sceptical, needing more encouragement, and there was others who were like, nah.
Yeah.
So it's not like sort of suddenly it flipped, but it's a strong, validation. And, Sue's always said with raising kids, you only need another two families or something to create a new normal for children. This is what we do here.
Yeah.
And it's just, people respond to that. And acting as though it's normal anyway is part of the way of sharing that culture. And I mean, some of us are more extreme in our ability to do that, and some of us can get very, be the sort that are confronting rather than diplomats. And I think my second mentor in permaculture, Hakai Tane, was one of those, like Mollison. And I remember a story of when he started working as floodplain planner for the Murray-Darling Basin Commission, I think in the late 80s. And he'd only been at work in Canberra for a couple of months, and he turned up in the morning tea room and starts handing out cake to people. And they said, oh, Hakai, what's the occasion? He said, what do you mean? It's the autumn equinox. Everyone looked blankly at him. And he said, he says, do you people celebrate the death of that Arab on a cross? No, that's right. He said, I'm going home at lunchtime. It's the equinox. He's taking half a day off. And then more blank looks, and that's when he said, that's right, you celebrate the death of that Arab on a cross, and walked out and left them. Now, that was sort of like a little more... But, that attempt to how you sort of create a new normal, as a one-man stand. Not many of us are, and maybe it's counterproductive to do that sort of thing in a lot of circumstances.
Half a day off at least.
But I think one of the issues, apart from that very positive thing, that you don't have to get the majority to actually get traction with something this is actually a lived reality.
That's right.
And we can see that in various ways, how the culture changes within that subculture, sort of attitudes to mixing compostable food with rubbish, and people starting to have like just an aesthetic revulsion rather than intellectual, no, that's wrong. No, it's dirty, mixing the food scraps with paper and metal tins or
Yes.
whatever. That's like an example of how it becomes, absorbed in as a new normal.
Yes.
But I think the other aspect is that if you look at the majority politics thing and say, is the magic 51% what we actually need to get any significant change in society, is forget it. It's absolutely useless if what that movement is trying to do is to radically change the direction of society. So let's take the example of the invasion of Iraq in 2003. What percentage of the population, of the Australian population, was against it? I think it was 70% or something. But we still went. Because the system was actually highly committed to that. And this system we've got, which is highly committed to debt and fossil-fuelled continuous GDP growth, is not going to change direction just because, oh shit, we've got to 51% or 60% or 70% of the population are gung-ho about it. Apparently in 1992, the majority of the Australian population thought the environment was more important than the economy. I mean, okay, what does that actually mean? What do people, and certainly the elites say, well, people don't know what they're talking about. They don't know really what they want. This is what they're going to get.
Yes.
So that idea that there's this following those sorts of trajectories are actually really powerful, I think, is a completely mistaken view, which is widespread and in the climate activism movement. You just got to get this majority tipping point. Yeah, you might be where everyone says, yeah, let's do something a bit different, but please don't, I don't want to actually sort of change anything, actually that I've got or whatever. And then there's other aspects about how does a culture, a subculture, move out and influence. And I think that has been, there's lots of ways that has happened that we should celebrate that we don't even understand. And a lot of people have said to me recently, gee, Gardening Australia is starting to look like a permaculture program. Yeah, well, in a sense, it always has been a little bit like that, and even, darling old Peter Cundall, well, he was a Communist Party activist in his youth. A lot of people don't realise that. And even though he comes over as the sort of conservative establishment of the Gardening Australia world, and of course there's been a long lineage of sort of permaculture influence through that sort of agents of positive influence that are not necessarily being labelled as success.
So on that whole thing of, you can have a majority of people wanting action, but, the machine is going off in that direction. Meanwhile, there are, particularly in a place like this, lots of things that we can and are doing. And, I think in some ways, it's not as if there's going to be one future. There's lots of futures. There's lots of realities all the time. And we are creating a culture now, and we can be strengthening that culture and really staying in the alive heart of it through our storytelling to each other, to ourselves, back to each other, our documentation, our celebration. And so, there's that, I think, a realisation that it's not so... Yeah. It's a complicated thing, and I don't know if this speaks to anyone else, but, you're one person, and you know that that the great system needs to change if we're going to get, climate a safe climate. And you just can't do that. And that frustration that you have of that. And so, yet you need to, almost like make a choice as if it's going to happen. And because the other way doesn't work. You've got to live as if the governments are going to catch up, and because the thing is, it's really big systems that need to change, isn't it? It's like whole big taxation systems and fuel systems. There's systems that only people with a lot of power can really make the change for. But then there's also all the things that we need to be doing to be living an experience of it. And those two things almost need to sort of... sorry, I'm getting myself... it's clear in here, but I can't get it out there. Yeah, it's like we've got to keep living our life with the... Because we can't make those big changes us individually.
I know exactly what you're getting at.
Yeah.
Can I say something?
Please help me with it.
While we were talking then, I was thinking about expectations, and expectations of others always, nearly always, in some form or another, even more so when you're really closely aligned to the way people think, result in disappointment. And that is the sadness of it all. So I guess functioning without that expectation on the external doesn't take away your energies that you devote to those things that you are passionate about and where you have the most ability to act. And that, of course, is at home, yourself, your family, your community, as you're moving out a little bit, as those horizons expand. And the joy of that is what will change everything. The other things will follow. It's just a matter of when.
That's right. And
So-
but you need to be, nourishing the community.
Yes.
So
Build
that
the
you can
strength
be
of
the
inner.
world that can support that change.
Yes. And it'll follow. It
Yeah.
will follow, definitely.
Look, I mean, I was asking Graham the other day about how many different committees and different things he's on, and doing things, trying to represent the community, and especially sort of environmental regulation by the local council, and where you sort of end up in this position as an environmentalist, where your main thing is trying to defend people to be allowed to run their self-reliant lives and create this new world against an environmental bureaucracy that is increasingly saying, no, you can't do anything because you might do something which is as bad as a multinational corporation, as you go out with your axe or let alone your chainsaw in the bush, that one person is the same as some global corporation with sort of massive bank finance, and it's all the same rules that have to deal with that, and that all of that articulation of working in more mainstream systems, and whether that's at local government level or larger, and the balance between that and doing and living the work, which I know Graham juggles all these balls, as he was showing me, the continuing seed selection of broad bean seed that's been going on for years, and all of those other detailed things that require the intention and the knitting constantly to be done, to maintain things and to actually demonstrate small, real, progressive steps, rather than just, hurrah, let's get everyone to get enthusiastic about adopting what exactly? Just copy what that person over there has just managed to work out how to do for themselves as a tinkerer. Can we scale that up?
That's right.
And the problem becomes that when the system turns and suddenly is looking for answers, what sort of answers have we got? Yes, we don't have answers that scale in the conventional sense. We have answers that scale by replication. And how many of us have tried to copy what some innovator tinkerer has done over here and then gone, it didn't work for us. Oh, how did they actually do it? That process of viral replication of appropriate solutions, it is very important. And to do that, there needs to be lots and lots of little lived examples at a local fine-grained scale, because the solutions are not universal. And what we find is the ones that we can currently replicate are all industrialised uniform solutions, like rooftop solar. The solar panel's the same solar panel manufactured in China, and yes, a solar installer has to come along and do a little bit of actually labour and go, oh, this roof needs a bracket on it, that one can go flat on the roof. But it's basically an industrial system. Most of the things we need to do are behavioural and biological, and they are site and situation specific.
Yes.
People specific.
Yeah, situation, including, what is this person? Is this person an animal person or a people person or a plant person or a tech person? And that will work for that person because they have that disposition, and it'll be a complete failure for this.
That's right.
And how do we grow all of those things? Yes, the growth is important, but the strength of the lived, robust examples is incredibly important. And to paraphrase Friedman, the neoliberal economist, that we need lots and lots of examples lying around, casually ticking away, working, so that when there's a crisis, that people will reach for those examples rather than reaching for the solutions of fascist demagogues, saying, look, your problem is this and we're going to do
And that's what Mayo was saying.
Well, I really relate to that growing up in an activist family with ideas of the things that we needed to make change. So I went into architecture school, we need to refashion society like this, we need to get rid of cars, we need to do this, and then realising I couldn't do any of them because they were ideological constructs, they were abstract notions, they weren't lived solutions. And so what I think we've got the seeds of here is the seeds of permanent culture, which is a whole lot of people living the solutions in their ways. What grows well here? Who grows that well? Who can share that well with that? It's an iterative, ongoing process. Dan, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I think perhaps one of the biggest things that I've found in my experience of it is that it gives me a greater sense of satisfaction in life. And I think that when I look around my own head, and when I look around the people in our community and the broader community as well, there seems to be a deep sense of dissatisfaction or of some sense of unhappiness or pointlessness. And I think we, perhaps have this basis of lived satisfaction. And that is an example that will drive people. They'll look at somebody like us, some people like us, and say, what satisfies that person? Why does that person always appear in a calm way or in a driven way? What is the basis of their drive? And perhaps that's another huge element of what we're building is to have satisfaction. It's not happiness. It's not necessarily contentment, because it's not an easy life. But it's I find it's a satisfied life. And I think that's pretty big.
Yeah, that's a huge aspect of, I think, some of the original motivations that unified myself and Mollison as a decade, a generation apart in age, that when I met him in '74, he had been at the forefront of quite a few environmental campaigns, and was getting to a point of dissatisfaction with trying to stop the bad things happening in the world, and more of a focus on why don't we just go out and create the world we do want ourselves, live it.
Yes.
And myself, coming from a political activist family, at the age of 19, the degree to which I managed to have any sort of adolescent rebellion, which was pretty hard when you could go and talk to your parents about things as weird, for my parents' generation, as marijuana and even LSD, and the things that most of my generation couldn't talk to their parents about. One of my forms of rebellion, in a way, was my parents' activism about, yes, the great fights to stop the bad things happening in the world. Well, bugger that, we're just going to go and live. You know, we are free to just do whatever we want. We can create this world. And when I met Mollison, and the social circle that he was in, it was actually that practical self-reliance that energised me, because although my parents taught me to think for myself and, work through values, when something went wrong with the plumbing, they rang up a plumber. And when I met Mollison and all his social circle, they did all that themselves, and if they didn't know how to do something, they knew a mate, whether design an ocean-going boat or build a house or, grow food. And I thought, wow, this is, we do what we want. And that empowerment to, especially in somewhere as lucky and free as Australia, that if we take a few risks and have got a bit of energy, for those of us who haven't been so oppressed and at the bottom of the system in various ways, have a huge amount of freedom to, just live that way that has meaning and satisfaction for us. And to avoid what some Dutch economist has classified very technically as bullshit jobs, that apparently some huge proportion of jobs in modern society, according to the people doing them, are complete bullshit. That the job they do has no beneficial purpose for society. And that's a really sad state of affairs. That that even the people doing it, like you'd think you would convince yourself that at least.
But they just can't. It's that bullshit.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if this could be a nice time to sort of get comments and questions and open up this discussion on these kinds of themes, the themes of what we're doing here now to build permanent culture and to grow connections, and how we might be attempting to seed that idea broader into community. I'd love to hear. Hi.
I look at the local bookshop, Verso Books, that's been around just since 2017.
Whereabouts is the bookshop?
In Hillsville, Verso Books. So it's just newly opened with, and I've got an ecological scientific background, so I'm kind of reading a lot of the non-fiction books and the permaculture course of Graham. So I'm really interested in this, of course, this whole way of, seeing how these things go into the mainstream. So I've been reading a lot of the new books that have come out, and I've really noticed a massive change over the last year and a half. That there are heaps and heaps of books that are now focused on, like there are all these sort of sexy, fashionable catch terms that have so much to do with permaculture, like zero waste, plant-based eating, and there's even in the financial sort of side of it, the financial independence. Then everyone, and they're often millennials or younger people, and they've often got like YouTubes and like the whole sort of social media thing happening. They're all getting out there and talking to each other, especially the younger ones, really wanting to do something about climate change. And they're almost like thinking they're reinventing or inventing their own solutions. They've all got different names, but they're all doing what you guys have been doing forever. And I've almost wondered too, like, there's so much power in, I've always been so about social media, but I see there's so much power in it. And when you use even just those words, it's like, oh, it's really fashionable to be zero waste and all that now. And it's just really, I just find that's an interesting way maybe of tapping into the mainstream and the younger people who haven't experienced or haven't almost exposure to permaculture, like us. So just a thought.
Yeah, well, that's certainly one of the intentions with RetroSuburbia. I mean, permaculture activism, apart from the counterculture and the Back to the Land movement and that thread, that early interest in permaculture was actually in the suburbs, especially in the suburbs of Melbourne in the 70s. And then in the 80s, it became more and more socially corrosive environment, and people who had that interest, a lot of them migrated to sort of rural places. But the idea of being more self-reliant, of growing food, of making things, of repairing things, has now gone from being deeply unfashionable to fashionable at a scale which now exceeds what was happening by far, I believe, what was happening in the 70s. Now, the previous waves, because there's been at least one other big wave, which was really the late 80s, early 90s, I think that was smaller proportionally to what was happening in the 70s. But this current wave is huge. And there is a huge amount of what you call eco-fashion in that, and incredible superficiality and whatever, but it's also, I think, an underlying intuitive sense that this is not just cool, this is sort of actually necessary, and this is serious work, at the same time that this is good fun and novel and something new. So there's always a value, especially for young people, in, here's a new idea. And even if it's rebranding an old idea, consciously or unconsciously, that there's value in that. But also over time, there can be, especially in a political sense, an incredible impediment to saying, here's a completely new idea that hasn't been tried, compared with that social conservative thing that here's something which has a great lineage behind it, which is this power of ideas and action which come from the ancestors and on into the future. And to build that sort of story as a sort of like a different story to the cool new novel thing. And, I think both those sort of ways of popularising things are, important. Of course, I've argued that unless we get economic contraction of people's real lived circumstances, the current fashion in growing food, raising chooks, even having milking goats in suburbia, repair cafes, all of that will actually only last about 5 years naturally, unless it actually starts to become, this is actually necessary, this is serious. And so that fashion awareness is a sort of an unconscious sort of recognition that, this needs to change, and it's the sort of like the leading edge of that. Of course, you also get the capitalism then goes, we can market that back to you. And of course, that's what happened with the hippies in the counterculture and this whole impression that was left of superficial airhead, eco-fashion that was associated with the counterculture, was capitalism going, oh, gee, there's a market, we can sell that back to you. And then the intelligentsia said, look how superficial all this is. And so I started to see that happening again with the hipsters and, the deriding of this sort of behaviour. And in calling RetroSuburbia, which is partly about just the hard thing of retrofitting to make fit for purpose, both the built environment, the biological of how we produce food, and most importantly the behavioural. It's also that retro fashion idea and saying, no, that's actually really appropriate, and celebrating that, claiming it back from the propagandist intelligentsia that says, oh yes, that's just, the airhead hipster, because we've seen all this before, as propaganda out of the system to say what you are doing is meaningless and insignificant. And yet at the same time, if 20% of the population did that, which would result in a 50% contraction, say, in people's participation in the monetary economy of paid work, like downsizing the number of hours people do, or within a couple, chucking in their job and restarting the household economy. So halving the amount of work done in the monetary system, especially in the corporate and government-controlled systems where most people work, and moving down out of that into the self-employment, small, direct, local economies, and reduce their consumption out of those same corporate and government-controlled systems by 50%. And to the extent that people have savings and investments and superannuation, withdrawing 50% of that out of the system. 20% of middle-class people, and most people in Australia are middle-class people in a global sense, doing that would result in a 10% contraction of GDP. And boy, would the system notice that. Now the system, what would be the response to that is potentially two responses. One is, what is this form of economic treason which is spreading everywhere? How do we kill this off? And then the problem is it's distributed. It has no centre of locus, no control. It's not coming from anywhere. So it's hard to kill it off. The other strategy is to go, what do you people want? And then the possible response might be, oh, you want to actually talk about reality, about policies, about direction of society. Oh, you need our participation, do you? You actually need our skills in the economy and our consumption. Oh, we didn't think we were needed, so we were going somewhere else. So my argument is that if the people who had the action seriously, radically, but realistically changed their relationship to the system, you don't need 50%. Like, if moles and bullies experience a 10% contraction in custom and it didn't go to Aldi, they bloody want to know what the hell is going on.
Well, they're already worried about farmers markets and CSA and the like.
Yeah.
Because to remember that they only make 2 to 3% on their products, so they are counting on that throughput. If it drops off, that 2 to 3% doesn't quite do it for them.
So that process of recognising how much power we have as middle class people is very, very different from workers in Australia in the 1919 general strike who could withdraw their labour, but their consumption was pretty insignificant, and half of it was in the household and community non-monetary economies anyway.
Yes.
And they had no savings or investments. And their labour was often easily replaced by another unskilled person. Whereas today, the systems are so complicated, replacing people who have very particular skills and experience in the system is quite difficult. And obviously there are solutions, like crank up the business migration rate from Asia and invite in more highly trained people to, or whatever. But we do actually have far more power than we acknowledge. So I think there's nowhere is that political framework being articulated. And I've just been, in the last 10 years, been starting to talk about it as an actual political strategy. And I actually suggested it in an essay called Crash on Demand, Welcome to the Brown Tech Future, because I was sort of saying, it looks like we're moving into my brown tech scenario, which is sort of pretty serious, I suppose, pretty depressing in some ways. Serious accelerating climate change and strong top-down response in a crisis response sense. And I was also responding to the fact of the climate emergency that was gathering strength at that time of we have to do something, you know, like a war-type response. And I was thinking how I was starting to see people, climate activists who'd sort of been on the front line of a lot of this work, incredibly energetic and powerful people in their own way, starting to become maybe burnt out and disillusioned. And I thought, what are those people going to do when they decide that that's all a failure? And in a way, I was saying, come over and join us here in the permaculture movement because we're having more fun. Now, the problem with that is the question is, but is there any agency? Is it going to change anything? And my answer to that was to say, well, if the climate crisis is as severe as you're saying, maybe the last agency left is through the financial system, which is the lubricant in the engine of the economy, which is completely fragile and completely unstable anyway, for all sorts of structural reasons. So if you needed motivation, you could say, if you move over here and we encourage this 20% of the population who are on board, really seriously on board, to halve their participation in the system and we get a 10% contraction in the economy, it might just tip over the financial system into a global financial collapse. And that might save us from the climate cooker by, you know, reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 50%, say, because the economy, most of the world economy, is supplying not just sort of bads and disservices, but things that people don't really need. You know, it's discretion, you know, the dog shampoo services. You know, I'm sure the people shampooing the dogs think their job is not a bullshit job and actually have a good relationship with the dogs and, you know, and the gymnasia and, you know, the people serving you the fantastically made coffee in the cafe. But, I mean, realistically, most of the economy is unnecessary.
Half of the population would die if they didn't have a coffee 5 times a day.
So, what I'm saying is that most of that economy could actually disappear in theory, and potentially basic needs could be met, and there could be this massive reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, more likely than some mass coordinated, globally connected government and corporate and community coordinated action to sort of power down in some more sensible way through doing some things super fast, like renewable energy. So if that's the case, I argued that global contraction is the only proven way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There's no proof that a renewable energy rollout will actually do it. It's a theory. It hasn't reduced greenhouse gas emissions yet.
No one's taking into account the energy that goes into the production of the infrastructure that produces these renewables.
Yeah. Now,
There's
some
massive big wind generators.
Some of the arguments are that once that energy has been produced over the life cycle of that equipment, that will have resulted in a net reduction, and that's probably true. But initially, what's happening as the growth in the renewable energy industries grow, that work is actually producing more greenhouse gas emissions than the reduction achieved so far. At some point there's supposed to be a crossover in that. No one actually knows when it will be, but at the moment it's still contributing to greenhouse gas emissions.
But also
Depends
the
on
moral
the
of the
quality
story.
of the material as well. As we're seeing now with a lot of these cheap solar panels, they're wearing out, they're not functioning after a few years, so they're not going to produce the return.
So just
But
to...
also the moral of the story is you can't buy your way ahead. You've got to just stop doing stuff.
But I think people's expectation of solar these days is very different to what it was 20 years ago, where it might be like, well, you don't run a hairdryer or a toaster or anything that draws quickly. You're not juicing with a juicer. Whereas now people want to live the way they've lived on-grid power with their solar panels. So that's a massive raise.
Yeah.
The expectation, there hasn't been a contraction.
Yep.
It's more like, let's use that technology but keep expanding.
That's what you were saying. How can we maintain our current state of life? Like, oh, yes, fantastic. Let's get solar on our roof and then keep going.
Electric
Exactly.
cars.
Yeah, so in that, recognising that, in that essay I suggested, so if the future of the earth, and let alone humanity, seems to be at stake, you're saying, like that's what people in the climate activism, this is like really serious. So therefore, if there is a mechanism by which maybe the global economy could sort of fall over and restart at a much lower level, and that might save us from moving into the climate cooker of, these tipping points of change, why wouldn't you contemplate actually working for that? And the response I mostly got was, but that would cause a whole lot of suffering in the world. And my answer is, so this story about the climate emergency and, 5 degrees of warming is just a fairy story to scare the punters, is it? If people are actually serious about that, then they should be prepared to do things that maybe would actually crash the global financial system because it's the weakest link, and without that lubricant, the global economy actually comes to a stall, independent of whether there's resources to keep doing things. Everything piles up on the wharves and doesn't get exported and whatever. Now, I was having this discussion 10 years ago with people at Sustainable Living Festival, people who've been at the forefront of the solar rollout, and they said things, but that would create a whole lot of, suffering. So I wasn't saying we should do that. I was saying we're going to live this way, whatever, and if that results in or contributes to the failure of systems that are inherently unstable anyway, well, we should be ready for that. And maybe in the pain and suffering, we'll say, oh, well, hopefully we at least got saved from being thrown into the climate cooker.
And does that include education system?
Of course, it includes all of those things. So what I was saying is, look, that's not my motivation. That's not the motivation of people in permaculture. Mostly the motivation is we want to live a better life now. But the fact that it could actually be economic treason to that extent should, if people are serious on that, we are in this war for the survival of humanity and the planet, there should be a preparedness to think about those sort of things. And yet most of the faith is still being put in how do we convince with rational evidence people at the top who have the power that we don't, please will you pull the levers in a different way, the opposite direction to what you've been pulling them for 250 if not 500 years.
That's
Well,
right, and that comes back to that
why
point I was
waste your effort?
trying to say before. And in which case, it's like permaculture all the way, in a way.
Yeah, but there's another aspect which seems contradictory to that. talking to the person over the back fence who doesn't even believe in climate change and swapping some lemons for eggs is really worthwhile, absolutely fantastic.
Yes.
So if you think about the mainstream, this great mainstream, which how do we know about that? Well, we sort of know about it by the people we work with or our family, but mostly we know about it through the media and mostly through mass media.
Yeah.
That tells us what it is, sort of, or where society's at. Or we go off to Coles and, you know, sorry, Moles. Never say the name, Moles and Bullies. You know, and we see people doing and we participate in, oh yeah, that's what, you know, that's normality. And if we think about that as a political spectrum, there's this big centre normal, and then supposedly there's these people out on the left who sort of somehow the Greens sort of represent now, and then there's all these groups out on the right, you know, let's say Pauline Hanson or Bob Catter. And of course those people are right over there, and we're looking at them through the lens, through this big lens of mainstream that tells us everything about what that is over there and how terrible that is out there. But, as I said a decade ago, if the Greens sat down with Bob Catter and talked about policy in relation to international corporations or whatever, actually find there's a whole lot of commonality.
Exactly.
But everyone manages to be spooked by not doing that, because those people are that opposite horrible culture. Of course, when we live in a local community, a small
It's not
rural
like that.
community,
That's right.
you know, the other person that you know is, well, you know, they work in the timber industry or something, and, you know,
Or
I've
they
got,
hate Muslims, and so you don't talk to them about that.
yeah, you know,
Some
that,
commonalities, you find your common ground.
yeah, but they're the person across the street,
Yeah.
or they're the person you know, who loads the gravel on the back of your ute in the.
That's
in the
right. I mean,
soil.
that is the lived experience that we have
Yeah,
here. you
and
know.
that is really valuable, making those connections.
I'm interested because I think you mentioned that in the Valley we do have this experience of there being quite a divide, I guess, between the environmentalists and those that are, you know, you wouldn't want to be ever associated with, even if they might grow their own veggies and they might have some chooks, they're not a greenie, they're not an environmentalist, they support jobs, they support the economy, you know, and it's very hard to actually find ways to build those connections. So, you know, if they're your neighbour, yes, you might, you know, chat to them or whatever and find some commonality there, but if you're not living next door to each other, like where do you create those links without there being that huge...
Yeah, well, some people choose that by being, you know, members of the local CFA, or to do it through, you know, the people they talk to as customers across the counter, or, you know, people's situations are all different, I think, you know, or of young parents sharing childcare or something. Now, obviously, some of those things get into, yes, I've actually got a group of like-minded people who are also geographically close, and that's really valuable when you've got both the circumstantial connection, like the person who you see daily for whatever reason, and they have similar values, because then you get both. But the people you just happen to come across and connect to, of finding something other than the language of the mainstream middle to be the discourse, because those people also find themselves alienated from what they think normality is in other ways, like everything's so fucking politically correct. You can't do this, you can't do that anymore. And, you know, I used to go out and cut some firewood off the side of the road, and it's bloody, you know, I'm killing the planet now, you know, and I got a fine, and, you know, like, and in work, you know, I have to fill out all these fucking forms, you know, like I thought I got away from that when I left school, and, you know, like, yeah, that there's, you know, so many ways in which people are feeling alienated from what looks like normality. So I think there's huge opportunities to do that, and it's really important to get beyond the demeanour of, yeah, that person's got the right clothes or they've got doing the right thing, you know, and to talk to the people who appear not to be and finding whatever that connection
That's right.
is.
Well, it's an interesting point at the moment. Can I just survey the room? How many people were involved in the sort of revisioning Warburton community consultation process that has happened over the last few months? 2, 3 hands out of a room of 60. That's a really small amount. You wrote a letter.
I've never heard of it to go to the event. I'm from Hillsville, never heard of it.
Yeah, well, you're from, yeah. Okay, so anyway, that the council was trying to survey as many people from the local area as possible to do a visioning process for the next 20 years. What's Warburton going to be like in the next 20 years? It came about partly because of the kerfuffle around the bike trails up into the hills and so forth, and trying to get some common ground. Anyway, so there wasn't a huge uptake of that. So when I spoke to some people at council about this conversation, they said they were very, very interested in the kind of future visioning that we can imagine here, and they would really value our contributions. Now, local councils are the most interesting level of government in terms of all the things that David's been talking about. It's globally, it's the local councils who are declaring climate emergency. You may have heard about that. And so there's also the community grants that are coming up. They're opening in 2 days, and there's a month or so to get in community grants, and they're going to be looked upon particularly favourably for this area. So a conversation that a few of us have been having around this convergence of people, David coming here and so forth, and this revisioning Warburton moment, is how could we put forward within our networks a vision of what this place could be like in 20 years. You know, an energy descent future, a resilient, sustainable, happy, what was your word, Dan? Satisfied community of people who are pulling back their energy from the mainstream systems, and developing a lot of self-reliance. Anyway, so I'm very interested in working with some people to put together a grant to ideally get David and Sue back here for a weekend and to do a proper big visioning and a mapping of what we've got going and where we'd like to get to. So that's just one idea, but over tea and cake, be very interested in, you know, people, you know, writing down or recording or flagging or putting notes on the event page on Facebook, you know, grant ideas, things that we could do to harvest this kind of energy and this moment, and the possibility of getting this wisdom, the wisdom in this room. There's an enormous amount of wisdom in this room, and not letting this moment, this gathering, just fizzle out.
Could I add to that? My observations, I see, and partly in response to what Marianne said earlier on about all these ideas coming out now in the literature. You've got permaculture ideas, but it's not overtly permaculture in your face. I think we're probably at a tipping point, and I've seen quite a significant change in the culture in the Yarra Ranges Council over the past decade or so. 2 or 3 CEOs ago, permaculture graduates working for council weren't allowed to mention the word permaculture in the council area because it was seen by the CEO as being a hippie form of gardening. And now we have, I think, 5 or 6, we've got a sustainability team that organised your event last night. 3 or 4 of those people are permaculturists. Around the Yarra Ranges Environment Advisory Committee table are another 5 people who have PDCs. 4 of them belong to Permaculture Yarra Valley. And so there's been a significant change in recent years to adopt permaculture and to listen to what permaculture has to offer.
So yeah, I spoke to the woman Jo. Jo, are you here? She was hoping to get here. About, and she was very keen to hear back from this work and to, financially contribute to this movement. So that's something that is really, it was very, very heartening, actually, to have that conversation, and excited about the possibilities.
Yeah, so.
And there's a question? Yeah.
Probably the natural point to out myself.
Oh, you're here, Simon.
I just realised you probably can't see me.
No.
I'm about to say bad things about you.
I'm not going to be surprised if you have bad things to say about cancer. But I do agree that it is the most interesting level of government. And I go as far back as to relate very closely to your story. I think I told David when he was here last that I dropped out of my first attempt at uni because I accidentally stumbled across Permaculture 1 in the library.
Simon, you and me.
But I have spent the last 15 years in Yarra Ranges Council, undercover. The long hair and the dreadlocks have gone. And I guess I would agree with Graham's assessment that I think the organisation, the culture of the organisation is really shifting too, in a direction that I would think is largely positive. Our new CEO, who started in February, when she introduced herself to the Environment and Engineering Directorate, mentioned that her first love, apart from serving our community well and meeting our community's expectations, was environmental sustainability. So I think it bodes well. It's early days to have that new leadership, but it bodes really well. And I think I'm not here. I've not been sent by the people you've been talking to. The challenges with local government is we run about 180 different services day to day. So it's really hard to stay across everything and we serve a big community. So it's really hard to stay across everything. But I did catch wind of this, and I guess I'm here both as a resident and a permaculture design certificate holder who loves nothing more than downtime in the garden, but also to hear what's discussed and if there's anything anyone thinks I might be able to do in my professional capacity. Then
What is your official role?
Desperately keen to hear it. I guess I've basically managed to weasel my way into a position where I lead a team of about 17. So the sustainability team Graham mentioned, and the biodiversity conservation team.
Great.
Who do all the landholder incentive programs around habitat.
Cunning work, well done.
Yeah, it's great. And we're seeing more and more that it is really important to relate to individuals in these positions, especially council, but not only council, that you have established those commonalities and you work within your means there, and that is supporting both the council officer and they are supporting you. So that's been something that I've been really pleasantly surprised to see, the growing number of people like Simon in there.
Yeah,
and
fantastic.
Last thing from me, but I think at its best, what I've seen work is when people inside the organisation, who David described it really well. Most of us are undercover. But when there are really, really strong events or really strong applications from groups into very formal, stuffy-looking processes like grant funding, when there's really strong interest in the community demonstrated by a public hall that's full, to bursting, then our councillors really notice that, and our management really notice that. And when we then put forward a proposal to say we think that grant application should be supported, or that movement should be, we think we should really investigate our street trees and see if more of them should be fruit bearing or whatever, then they kind of go, oh yeah, all right. And as long as we call it a pilot, not to make it a new policy until we've evaluated that, we gather the evidence and all that rubbish, then they tend to go, all right, let's try that. There seems to be a strong interest in the community, and everyone, in terms of common ground, everyone at council agrees that they're there to look after the community. So it's really just a matter of going, well, this is what the community wants. So let's get over our fear of doing something different and have a crack.
well, you know, this many people at not much more than a week's notice. I think there's a strong community of people who are interested in these kinds of outcomes. We said we'd speak for about an hour and a half, which we have been. Are there some more people with statements or questions or something they'd like to say? Looking at you, Antonia, before we... Yeah, maybe Marie first.
I was really interested when you were talking about the sustainability of sustainability or permaculture, where you were talking about lineage rather than waves coming and going.
Yeah.
And I've never thought about that concept, and I think that's a really important area to look into. And one thing, well, I don't know whether it's right to sort of start to mention some of what I've been thinking about for quite some time, and looking for people who are either thinking along those lines. But hearing what you said today, I can really, I feel that it's something that is really, can gel with what you said. I have a background in welfare. My family was very much coming from a social justice bent, and I have a background in welfare work and in health. And I've always, from my mother's southern European background, they were very much people of the land and the seasons. And I've carried that. So with all of that, I've just for quite some time now, looking for people who are interested, this idea of helping young people come on board who generally have lost their way, feeling very discouraged, feeling aimless. I work with some of these young people, and what the government already has in place, as far as, you know, a lot of these people don't work, but for people older than 55, there's this idea of being able to do voluntary work, so that you can actually be entitled to sensible payments, just to cover that. But what I'm really interested in, and it links up with also the woofing system, which to me is a huge groundswell of potential, along the lines of what you're talking about. Because you have these young people who are searching and coming from all sorts of backgrounds and circumstances, who are getting a taste already within a supportive community environment of like-minded people, and are just suddenly being exposed to what we're talking about here. And I just think there's a huge potential to tap into and to support young people who are troubled, who are, you know, really needing some guidance, some mentoring, and but putting them on a track that is really going to change the world.
I'm wondering if anyone's got any comments or response to Marie's.
I actually have quite a strong response to that, which is I so fully want to believe in what you're saying, but woofing, internships, HelpX are generally available only to people who are coming from a background of privilege, who don't desperately need to earn money to survive. To go woofing, to do an internship, you have to have some sort of financial stability behind you,
And I so desperately would like to see young people who are immigrants, who are refugees, who have experienced intergenerational poverty. I've also worked in these areas in our community. I so desperately want to see those people have the same opportunities as the predominantly privileged people to whom woofing is an option. Have people seen?
I've been a single mum for a long, long time, and when my kids were 2 and 4, I took them woofing. I had a single parenting pension, which was next to nothing. I was paying rent, but I was sharing my house with other people. And I found that I could travel and stay in national parks and go woofing. So when I went woofing, it was a way to be somewhere for a week until my next pension came in. Then I could go to the next national park, buy some petrol or whatever, but then I'd go woofing again because it was somewhere that I had somewhere to stay, and it was somewhere that I had somewhere to eat, and there was company. So I have a complete opposite experience.
You're a wonderful exception.
I really had the experience of trying to woof after doing my PDC with my son who was 4 at the time, and the response was that he's going to look after your child. I'm like, well, he will garden. And the only time I was able to actually have him was when I paid to do a building workshop, and then it was okay for him to be there for the 5 days of the Earth building workshop on this community in New Zealand. Other than that, I just met all these couples with their children woofing, and I wasn't given access to that.
I was also a single mother.
Yeah.
I was living with my goat in my garden. I was evicted, as you are, for rental opportunities. My next house burnt down and I was homeless. And, you know, I couldn't do what you did. I had experiences like yours.
Yeah. You were very lucky.
Yeah, you had a wonderful experience. Myself aside, I still recognise I come from a mixed up life. I'm white. I was born in Australia. How much better can it get? And
be a man.
Well, on
Yay.
that fantastic interjection.
Can I respond to that as a white male, older white male of obvious extreme privilege and, lived a very fortunate life. A story from one of our volunteers who I would sort of call a professional, and he'd been on the road for 15 years, staying mostly at communities, and claimed to live on $500 a year.
where did that come from?
Good question. Actually, he's the exact person you were talking about. He was actually from one of the elite academic families of California. His uncle worked on nuclear physics, and Lawrence, very smart character. And anyway, he told a story about one of his favourite ways of getting by, of course, was getting food out of what we call skips, and they call dumpsters. And he was working the bins in San Francisco one day, and he's at work, going through the bins, getting out organic food, and he's talking to a guy next to him, black guy working the bins. Oh, what are you looking for? Guy says, oh, cans. Says, what do you do with the cans? Says, oh, sell them. Oh, yeah, what do you do with the money? Oh, buy food. And there's our friend getting perfectly good organic food out of the bin. And that this tragedy of, to feel a real person in society, one must earn money in the monetary economy to be validated as a human, when they're at the taking. And it's actually that person, that very person, that empowered person, that person that may have financial resources behind them, but has that strength of direction and choice that I can do things, I can deal with my environment, I can respond in appropriate ways, more than that there's this secure financial backing. It's those internal resources
Yes.
that, and that's the tragedy, that's the poverty, where
Those
people...
internal resources need to be built in, that sounds rotten. I'd like to see those internal resources given the opportunity to grow in people who have been desperately disadvantaged by intergenerational poverty.
Yes, yes.
And I don't think, and that's a huge issue here in the valley.
It is.
Yeah.
It really is.
We have to engage those people.
That's right. I know, I mean, that's very much something that is in my heart of, like, you know, I feel so resourced. I feel I'm in a room of people who are very resourced, very rich internally. But how do we spread that kind of skill outward?
Well, isn't that also connected to the story I was talking about of talking to the people who have extremely different values?
Yeah.
Because some of those people are the people who've actually managed to get up within the system, but come, you know, those other people who are the shattered ones, you know, the ones that haven't even got the resources to sort of, hate the greenies or Muslims or whatever. They're just trying to survive day today. But in a sense, you know, it's actually part of often that same cultural lineage where there's been these huge, savage, you know, jettisoning of people and trashing of people, which leads to, you know, the election of people like Trump and
That's right.
Brexit.
That's right.
Where many of us live in very, very diverse community, Badger Creek, there was one gathering, the most successful gathering, which got the greatest amount of community engagement, which was trying to get community input for a planning for a new playground. The people who organised it basically got put on a free sausage sizzle, and that brought these people out because a sausage in bread meant they didn't have to think about feeding their kids that night, and they discovered with their sausage in bread in hand for a thing that meant that, you know, great, we're eating tonight, and they were valued, and that was a new experience. So that was an over the fence kind of way to sort of engage with the people who would never ever have been to a community discussion.
Yeah, that's right.
The irony is, of course, that I actually live in an environment where the whole environment is a playground.
That's right.
And this is something I said on a permaculture design course in Kangaroo Valley in 1995, and, you know, looking at people's design exercises and saying, oh, you know, we're building this lovely little, you know, going to design this lovely little seat here and this, you know, looking out on the rainforest and saying, guys, we're all already in paradise. You know, maybe we need to focus on some of the basic things that are not happening, and that, in a way, this neediness, this dependency on someone's got to provide something, that sense of poverty and lack of this empowerment, and especially in relation to the commons, that the public land around is our place. We inhabit this place. And how, you know, whether you own a house or have somewhere to live, that this is your territory and space. And to recreate that opportunity that kids and people can do that, and they can even do it in ways that maybe damage the environment in small ways. Our son's hunting mentor used to say that, you know, there's plenty, you know, there should be enough trees in the world that kids can go out with an axe and attack nature, and it's okay, you know, like,
Yes.
it's not like the world's not going to end. That all sorts of different explorations of, you know, or even just getting your anger out, you know, that those opportunities are being closed off for so many people who are disadvantaged, and finding ways, and this is
Not
what's...
just disadvantage. Why are we locking our kids up in school for 5 days a week, may I ask? Why aren't we mentoring our kids here and there? What are their interests? They don't come through the school. Why are these kids that are disadvantaged, aren't they supposed to get equal opportunity, the same? They're not catered for. Schools do not cater for all children's needs.
And that's also
And that's how the system continues to shove our youth into the treadmill and to keep them. I'm sorry, I get really angry about this. I think
You thought I was a radical.
I think kids are so disadvantaged these days. They've got so much crap in their lives but they don't have the freedom to get bored and to come up with solutions that they have within them. Kids are just brilliant and they get stymied when they go to school. So,
Can I just? I really wanted to just honour the plans that we've got here, which was for an hour and a half conversation. So we've been 20 minutes over. So not to cut you off, not to cut anyone off. Let's have the conversation to continue over tea and cake. I know there's. We want the conversations to continue. There's fire here. Let's keep working.